Ultimately, Selangor once again fell short as they wrap up their AFC Champions League 2 group stage campaign with a 0-1 loss to Lion City Sailors, their fifth defeat of the campaign to finish at the bottom of the All ASEAN group with just only a solitary point. This is easily Selangor's worst Asian campaign. Asia campaign paling teruk. And the overall display from this match against Sailors, who needed the win and did get the 3 points, but eventually bowed out after Persib Bandung defeated Bangkok United in the other group to finish top, with Bangkok edging ahead of Sailors on a better head-to-head record in this tournament. But this time round, Tayaja attempts to look back at why Selangor had such a teruk Asian campaign this season. Kejohanan yang teruk Asia di Selangor. And firstly, we have to look at how the squad was being set up. Because at the start of this season, the management and the fans were expecting a much better showing from the Red Giants after they bowed out at the group stage last season. But instead of building on what they learned in that first campaign in a while, the Red Giants instead went on to have easily campaign paling teruk. Really, it was so bad that former head coach Kazuhito Kinoshi was sacked just 1/3 into the group stage campaign, and he was eventually replaced by Christophe Gamel, who saw out the remainder of the campaign. And there were very few bright sparks in what was already expected to be a very tough group, especially when they were up against last season's ACL2 runners-up Lion City Sailors, Indonesian champions Persib Bandung, and one of the more consistent top Thai teams over the last few years under Toshtawan Suripan, Bangkok United. But still, the Merah Kuning faithful would never have realized how teruk they would be in Asia. So teruk that that even though there were a few highlights, the way the Merah Kuning allowed themselves to be torn open once too often at the back, particularly when they squandered the 2-goal lead to allow Persib to come back to win at the Petaling Jaya Stadium, which triggered a few ultras to invade the pitch after the game, and also the mass ultras riot, or you can say attempt to seek a confrontation with the club CEO Dr. Johan Kamidon over the failings of the once Malaysian powerhouses, in which they were still seeking to desperately to regain those glory days. And the problem is, despite having a number of really good players at their disposals, I mean the Jordanian international duo of Muhammad Abu Al Nadi, the defender, the centre back, and Noor Al Raabde, the centre midfielder, and having their new signing Trigon Morales from Brazil, who eventually delivered as the club's top scorer in Asia in this campaign that was just wrapped up, with 4 goals in 6 matches, including the equalizer in their last game that allowed them to secure their only point of this group stage. And then you got Faisal Halim, who shone as the captain of the team, even though he had to miss 1 or 2 games due to injury. And then you got Quentin Ching, who provided a number of assists down the right, especially when he excelled under the Kinoshi wingback system. And you had Zach Clough, who actually shone brightly for much of the game in spite of the overall poor team performances. But yet, at the same time, there were also other individuals who were good on their day, but at times also were infuriatingly inconsistent. And you can say they caused quite a bit of agony. I mean, goalkeeper Kalamula or Hafiz, who has been actually quite brilliant in those appearances in the ASEAN Club Championship Shopee Cup campaign, pulling a number of big saves when called upon, especially in their group opener in Southeast Asia against defending champions Buriram United, and also recently in their most recent ASEAN Club Championship group match, as well as against the Sailors, where once again entrusted to be the number one jersey after initially giving way to Sheikh Izan at the at the beginning of the Gamel raid. But Kalamula showed why he was the preferred top choice for Kinoshi, and right now under Gamel, with his with his with his good positioning and quick reflexes to keep Selangor in contention as much as possible. But there were times where some of the mistakes were magnified, particularly in the opening group game against Bangkok United. Yes, it was played in the heat, but there was no excuse for the errors of judgment Kalamula made in that loss to Bangkok United at home, which put their campaign off on the wrong foot as he conceded 4 goals in a campaign. And then you had Sailors in Bishan Stadium, where he could not keep up the rampaging display from new Sailors signing Anderson Lopez. But it was particularly in that game where after he lost, actually more like after Kinoshi lost his job, Sheikh Izan proved to be more of a liability rather than an asset under Gamel, especially when he was called upon, because unlike Kalamula, who prefers to take the initiatives and is comfortable on the ball at his feet and is quick with his reflexes, Sheikh Izan is more towards being on. He prefers to defend his goal on the line and as close to the goal as much as possible, compared to Kalamula, who was more willing to take risks. And that conservativeness from Izan was particularly telling when it was his missed kick that led to Persib Bandung stealing all 3 points 7 minutes into injury time, as Persib came from behind to win 3-2 after the break. So you had that infuriating goalkeeping problem. Then how about the defender situation? Harith Haikal was, you can say, that opening game again against Bangkok United, where it was like, what the heck happened? It's like he was unable to keep up with the Bangkok striker, who was chasing down en route to goal, and that one-footed tackle behind on the opponent's back saw him suspended after he received a straight red card. And that his absence was pretty telling, as Sharul Nazim struggled, where usually the pairings for the defense was particularly inconsistent, partially due to suspensions, partially due to injuries, and partially due to, you can say, there was no settled backline for either Kinoshi or Gamel, as they struggled to figure out which defensive combination was the best to deal with. For much of the campaign, the wingbacks or fullbacks, when they switched from the 5-man wingback under Kinoshi to the back 4 under Gamel, Kevin Diroram on the left, Quentin Ching on the right, they were certainties. But in the heart of the defense, it was much less so. Tonight, it was Musa Diarra and Harif Haikal. Previously, it was, if I'm not wrong, I think at the start of the campaign, it was actually Abonadi and Harif Haikal, eventually replaced with Sharul Nazim. Sharul Nazim was found not exactly cut out for that role. And the more the shuffling of the backline, especially with Richmond Ankras actually suffering from that lack of confidence, that was where opponents found opportunities, especially the better strikers in the group. Whether it was Andrew Jong of Persib Bandung, Anderson Lopez of the Sailors, or even Ilas Al-Haf and Musin Al-Ghassani from Bangkok United. These were the guys who were able to exploit the uncertainty in the back line to have their to enjoy those spaces to score, and also exploit those gaps and make them more unsure of themselves the longer the campaign went. So this whole entire defensive problem turns out to be the biggest Achilles heel in the entire campaign. For Selangor are the only team in that group to have an outstanding negative goal difference of -8, with 15 goals conceded through those 6 matches. Now, I already talked about the defense. What about the midfield? The midfield itself, you can say there was also quite a bit of shuffling here and there, especially although initially except for tonight's games, the two constants were Noah Lyon, the usual captain, and also Zach Clough. Neither of them were available tonight, so it was Mukari Ajmal partnering Picha Aura, and neither looked steady. And this was where the absence of an assured midfield allowed the Sailors to take thorough control in the middle of the park for throughout tonight's game. And that left with the defense that Gamal named with plenty of work to do. And even with those two around, it was pretty clear that sometimes with Selangor often more on the back foot than not, it was pretty frustrating for Lion to try to keep plucking those gaps in the middle of the park while trying to protect his defense and also attempting to play the role of the link man between defense and attack, all at the same time. So this was where the midfield was in a way found wanting, especially tonight. Tonight, the entire midfield belonged to the Sailors. Sure, say the Singapore champions played a counter-attacking play, relying on the quick breaks from Bart Ramsala and Anderson Lopez, and as well as Maxim Lestienne on the right to stretch the Selangor defense to their limit. But it was also pretty telling that neither Bukhari Ajmal nor Picha Audra, the two who were assigned the midfield roles tonight, were able to impose themselves in the middle of the park. And this allowed the Sailors to have relatively full control of the game, or much of the control of the game. So there lies the problem. Either the midfield was overworked defensively, or in tonight's case, there was no midfield to call off. Now, what about the attack? The attack was actually the one bright spot for this ACL2 campaign for the Red Giants. I already mentioned about Chirigor being the top scorer with 4 goals out of 7. Faisal Halim contributing 1. There was also one own goal as well. and you have Alif Izwan Yuslan with the other goal. So you can see that in the attack wise, you got Faisal Halim on the left, and for the first, at least for the first half of the group stage campaign, Quentin Cheng providing the assist down the right. But as much as Trigor was able to find the back of the net in spite of the Red Giants' difficulties, it was also pretty evident that Selangor, the Selangor forwards were left to, you can say, find those to be were left to their own devices to exploit any gaps they had at the back, I mean in the opponent's back line, to try to find spaces in which they could counter, especially down the wings. And whether it was under Kiroshi or under Gamel, it's pretty evident that the best chances for Selangor to get anything out of those 6 tough matches were to be down the wings. Faisal Halim, when he was playing, was a threat down the left. Unusually, Quentin Cheng, the fullback or wingback under Kinoshi, was the main threat down the right when he was called upon to do the job, going down in the forward row. And you had Trigger, who was able to cause quite a formidable presence even in tonight's game as well against the Sailors. In fact, it was Trigger who forced Ivan Susak to a low diving save in the first half, Faisal Halim being able to exploit those gaps that the Sailors left behind as they went in search for the goal, for the 3 points that mattered, even though eventually they got the goal, eventually they got the Sailors got a win, but it was ultimately futile for last season's ACL2 runners-up. But still, with the defense being stretched, the Sailors' defense being stretched at certain points in the game, thanks to the ingenuity of Faisal and Chirigor, the Sailors didn't have it all that easy during those periods where they were put under a little strain. Yes, I will say a little, because Selangor spent more time defending as usual and were doing more of the counter-attacking in search for the goal. And this is where one of the few rare bright lights, where the majority of the positives came from for the Merah Kuning in Asia this season. It was in attack. Goals do have the impact of turning the game around or putting the team in a more comfortable position. But the Red Giants' defensive vulnerabilities under either coach was too obvious to ignore, was too magnified not to be noticed. And whether you can say the lack of concentration and all these things, it did result in the Selangor Ultras boiling over after that Persib Bandung game last month. And that saw Selangor, the Ultra cells, causing a riot outside the stadium after the game, because the fans were already that upset after such a disastrous match where they took the lead only to throw all 3 points away. Tonight, though, it was more of a case of Selangor overall being second best to Sailors, who were on the front foot for the start. They put the Selangor defense under a lot of pressure. They had more shots than Selangor, and they had one goal and could have scored 1 or 2 more if not for the reflexes of Kalamula. But ultimately, that whole overall display showed the big gaps between those guys who have shown that they can deliver, and you can count them with one hand, or even maybe a finger or two from the other hand. Then what about the rest? Are they really good enough to be at this level? Are they really trusted enough to be able to play in the Asian club competition, even when it's in the lower tier? Very hard to say. while there were a few promising youngsters who did deliver in bits and pieces, such as Alif Izwan Yuslan, Alif Haik, I mean, and I think one of Izwan Yuslan was the more notable standout in this campaign, but there are too few to count. And because there are so few that you can count, then it shows overall that this Selangor squad ultimately is really not ready for Asia at this moment. Really unready. Compared to your Kuala Lumpur City, who pushed themselves all the way to the 2022 AFC Cup final, or even the other teams who took over when Selangor were not involved in Asia. There were a number who did alright, there were one or two who didn't do as well, but nonetheless, this whole disastrous campaign showed that Selangor tidak ready for Asia after all. Really, as tough a group as it is, as uphill the task it was, but allowing the other three teams to trample over them that easily is indicative of, as a team, as a club, how good or not so good the first team of the Red Giants were in preparing for Asia. And even with the change of coach, with the slight shift in focus towards the domestic games as well as the Shopee Cup, it is also pretty evident that there are other Malaysian teams who will release that chance of taking over their place in Asia, especially with Malaysia still having one place in the 2026-27 ACL2 tournament. I think it would be better whether it's the likes of Sabah or Terengganu or Kuching City or Kuala Lumpur City once more to step forward and show Selangor how they ought to represent Malaysia in future Asian club competitions. Because ultimately, in this disaster of the ACL2 campaign, Selangor showed that they are simply not good enough to be at this level.